Have you ever, like, I don't know, found yourself really wrestling with how you even know anything, you know? Like, what are the real pathways to knowledge and how do those beliefs actually, like, take shape for us?
Yeah, I think for anyone, especially if you're kind of interested in philosophical inquiry and questions, that kind of question about the nature of knowledge and belief, that's pretty fundamental stuff.
Yeah. And so today we're going back in time, centuries past, to a thinker who was dealing with exactly those kinds of issues.
Oh, cool.
So we're looking at Sa'ad ibn Mansur ibn Kammūna, a 13th century philosopher from Baghdad. And his story gets even more interesting, especially for you, because he was a Jew who was participating in this whole world of Islamic philosophy.
Oh, wow, yeah. That's a really interesting, like, historical interplay there.
Exactly, yeah. So we're talking post Ibn Sina, post Avicenna, but
Mm.
it wasn't just like quiet after that. It was, as our sources describe, a remarkably creative period, both for science and philosophy. And even though we've gotten more scholarship recently on figures like Ibn Kamuna, it's still kind of a challenge to really get all the subtle details. It's like uncovering a hidden gem, I would say.
Yeah, totally. Like, he's not just repeating old ideas, but really grappling with them in his own way.
Exactly. So what we want to do today, for you, is pull out some of the key insights, kind of explore what his life was like, his world, his big philosophical interests,
Okay,
especially on the soul. And also this concept that was so central to his thinking, this idea of intuition or hads.
cool.
And then I'll also look at how he thought about religious ethics and some of these really cool paradoxes that are attributed to him. So it's like this focused exploration to give you a better grasp on medieval philosophy
Okay.
and this really fascinating conversation between different intellectual traditions and the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy. That's our main source for this deep
So,
dive.
yeah, that's a good one. A really strong starting point for this stuff.
Yeah, it gives you a good foundation. Okay, so let's start by just unpacking his life a bit, the world he lived in. There are a few biographical markers. It seems like he was probably born in Baghdad, lived there.
Good.
But there's also stuff that points to him spending time in Aleppo, which was another big intellectual center. So for you, understanding how important Aleppo was back then could really help us figure out what influenced him, right?
Right. Yeah. Aleppo in the 13th century was kind of a hub,
Mm.
a real mix of different scholars, lots of debates going on in all sorts of fields.
Mm.
So if Ibn Kamuna was there, he would have been exposed to a much wider range of, philosophical schools, arguments, and that could explain some of what makes his work unique, I guess.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah.
He also seems to have, had connections with important people, corresponded with other big intellectuals like Nasir al-Din al-Tusi. And later on in his life, before he died in 1284, he moved to Hilla. Now, at first, scholars thought he moved because of negative reactions to one of his books. But current thinking suggests it might have been tied to the execution of a patron.
Oh,
So even for these abstract thinkers, their lives could be really tied up with the politics of their time.
absolutely. Yeah. Philosophical work wasn't always separate from what was happening in society, the politics. Those pressures could really change a scholar's whole career, even their intellectual path.
Right.
And that changing understanding of why he moved to Hilla, it just shows how important it is to look at the historical context when we're trying to understand these philosophical figures, their lives.
For sure. Okay, now let's get to something a bit more tricky. His religious identity. So we know he was born Jewish, but if you just look at his philosophical writings overall, it seems like he's writing from a Muslim viewpoint.
Okay.
But then when you look at his works on comparing different religions, there's a definite preference for rabbinic Judaism.
Hmm.
And even in his notes on Islamic theology, he's subtly disagreeing with certain points.
Interesting.
And then there's his interest in Sufi piety, which doesn't really line up with what we know about Jewish practices back then. So the big question, of course, the one that's been bothering scholars for a while, did he convert to Islam?
Yeah, that's a tough one. It's a question that's been debated back and forth, even for people who really know a lot about religious history.
Right.
You've got Steinschneider early on saying, yeah, he converted. But then that idea has been challenged by people who focus on Judeo-Arabic studies, like Baneth, and more recently, Pourjavati and Schmidtke.
Hmm.
Maybe the most straightforward account, although it could be biased, is from Rashid al-Din Hamadani, who was also Jewish originally, but he converted to Islam later. And he actually criticized Ibn Cohen for not converting.
Huh.
So, it's a mixed bag of evidence. No clear answer.
It seems like we just have to accept that there's some ambiguity there. And for someone like you, a philosopher who's interested in how fluid identity can be, how hard it is to put people in neat categories, Ibn Kammūna is a fascinating example.
Yeah, I see what you mean.
It shows how blurry the lines were between religious and intellectual groups in that period. And maybe it says something about his own complex inner world, too.
Yeah, it really highlights how we can't just force these historical figures into rigid categories,
Yeah.
and how people back then could be part of and draw from many different intellectual and religious traditions at the same time.
Yeah, for sure. Okay, let's move on to what he actually wrote, which thankfully is a bit more solid. So our source says his Tankhya, also known as the Examination of the Three Faiths, is especially important for scholarship today.
Go ahead.
What he was trying to do there was find a single theory of prophecy that would work for Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and he wanted to judge it based on shared philosophical standards. That's pretty ambitious, right?
Yeah, it is. It's a really ambitious project. Just the idea of finding a philosophically sound understanding of prophecy,
Hmm.
one that could unite these big religious traditions, that's a new approach,
Hmm.
And although the examination doesn't come off as super aggressive or polemical, it definitely leans toward Jewish viewpoints, drawing on Maimonides and Judah Halevi.
Hmm.
And it's funny, Christian and Muslim thinkers responded to it, wrote rebuttals,
Hmm.
but there's no record of any Jewish response to this attempt at philosophical reconciliation.
Yeah, and that's a pretty noticeable absence. Also, considering the Mongols ruled at that time and they weren't initially Muslim, it's interesting that there's no real engagement with Buddhism in this work,
Right.
or actually in any of Ibn Kammuna's writings that we know of. You'd think a philosopher as curious as him would have looked at such a big religious and philosophical tradition of that time.
Yeah, you'd think so, right.
Yeah.
It probably says something about the specific intellectual circles he was in and the main religious traditions that mattered to him. But it does make you wonder about how broad his comparisons really were
Right.
and what made him focus on what he did.
He also wrote this shorter piece comparing Rabbinites and Karaites, which again shows he's more on the rabbinic side. But for those of you who are really into how philosophical ideas develop, his commentary on Sudawardi's Al-Talwahat is probably his most important contribution to the history of philosophy.
Hmm.
It's the first known commentary on that work. And, that work was based in Aristotelian thought, but it also had these important parts of what's called Ishraqi philosophy, a school of thought that's all about illumination and intuitive knowledge as the main ways to understand things.
Yeah, right. And that commentary was really important for spreading Suhrawardi's ideas. Through it and his influence on later thinkers like Quwwaldin al-Shirazi and Kammūna basically helped to get those early ideas about Ishraqi thought out there, which, like you said, is all about prioritizing intuitive insight.
Exactly. And then there's Al-Jadid fi Hikmah, the New Wisdom, which is like a whole overview of 13th century science and philosophy. What's cool is that he seems to have played around with different versions of it. There's the long version, a condensed one called Takkiz, and then maybe a middle-length one called Risala fil Hikmah. So it seems like he was trying to make the material work for different kinds of people and interests.
Yeah, that makes sense. Like he understood that not everyone needs the same level of detail.
Mhm.
That's interesting to see, like how people thought about teaching and spreading knowledge back then.
Yeah. He also did some more, I guess you could say, spiritual writings,
Okay.
like Kalimat Wanjiza and Ithbat al-Mabda.
Right.
And he even wrote glosses, like commentaries, on Fakhruddin al-Razi's Al-Ma'alim. Now, those glosses are really interesting, especially for a philosopher, because he uses all the technical terms of Islamic theology.
Right.
But then it seems like he's also kind of sneaking in critiques, maybe even anti-Islamic arguments, especially when it comes to the idea of miracles proving prophecy. But later on in those glosses, he actually criticizes Judaism and Christianity specifically, too. It's like he's working on different levels at the same time, sometimes openly, sometimes more hidden.
Yeah, I see that. It shows he really knew how to use different intellectual languages.
Yeah.
And he was willing to push back against established theological ideas, even if it was in a subtle way.
Right.
Seeing him shift his criticisms within the same work, it's like a window into how complex his intellectual position was.
Exactly. And we can't forget those paradoxes, the shubuhat that are connected to him.
Right.
Those have kept philosophers talking, especially in Iran, right up to today.
Hmm.
We'll come back to some of those, but it's clear he was a really productive writer, tackling all sorts of philosophical and theological questions.
Yeah, his writings are like a tapestry of 13th century intellectual life.
Right.
He was engaged in all these different philosophical traditions, and he made his own original contributions, too.
Okay, so let's focus on something that was really important to Ibn Kammūna, the study of the soul, ilm al-nafs. Our source says this was a theme throughout his work, and he even wrote 3 whole books about it, specifically trying to prove that the soul is eternal and to disprove other views. What do you think might have made him so interested in this?
Well, I think to really understand why he was so into the soul, you have to remember the legacy of Ibn Sina and Avicenna.
Right.
Avicenna famously said that self-awareness, what he called nafs, which is interesting because in Arabic it means both soul and self, is the most basic, most certain kind of knowledge. And this idea, it really challenged traditional Aristotelian psychology. And thinkers after him, like Ibn Kammūna, they really had to grapple with what it meant for understanding the self, and consciousness.
So he took that core idea from Avicenna about the soul being individual self-awareness.
Exactly.
He even starts his essay on the immortality of the soul by defining the soul as that thing we're talking about when we say I, like a very direct first-person way of looking at it.
Yeah, absolutely. For Ibn Kammūna, that immediate, undeniable awareness of yourself as an individual, that was the starting point for understanding the soul. Even in his more religious work, Subtle Insights, he emphasizes this certainty of the I as the foundation for understanding the nature of the soul.
Yeah, but here's where he differs from Avicenna on this really important point.
Mhm.
Whether the soul exists before it's connected to the body. Avicenna said no, but Ibn Kammūna argued pretty strongly that the soul existing before the body, that was a necessary part of it being immaterial, and it was also key to proving that it survives after death.
Yeah, that's a big difference in how they thought about things.
Right.
Ibn Kammūna's thinking was that if the soul isn't material, then it had to exist in some other state before being connected to the physical body. And he saw this as super important for building a solid philosophical argument for the soul's immortality. He even tried to make Avicenna's arguments about psychological stuff stronger. He famously tried to present Avicenna's flying man thought experiment as a syllogism, which is a demonstration of logical reasoning. Now, scholars still debate whether he actually pulled that off, but it shows he was really committed to using rigorous philosophical arguments in this area, trying to ground even these imaginative thought experiments in logic. It's got to resonate with you as a philosopher.
Oh, definitely. And he didn't stop there. He even said he'd come up with the first real proof for the soul's eternity a parte hante, meaning from before it's connected to the body. And his view is basically that the soul is the same as the intellect akul when it's in a body. It's like he's saying our capacity for thought, that's what really defines the soul when we're alive.
Yeah, for Ibn Kammūna, the soul is intellectual at its core. Being connected to a physical body doesn't change that. It just defines how it exists in that particular moment.
Right.
And this focus on the intellect of the essence of the soul, it's really important for understanding his whole philosophical system.
And that brings us to another big part of Ibn Kammūna's thought. This idea of hads, which is often translated as intuition. Our source says it's crucial to understanding his philosophy, from psychology to epistemology, the theory of knowledge, and even his ideas about prophecy. So what exactly does hads mean here?
Okay, so strictly speaking, hads is when you grasp the middle term of a syllogism, and it can happen really fast, leading to a conclusion that you just know is true. Now, for you, a syllogism is like a logical argument, where you use deductive reasoning to reach a conclusion based on statements that are assumed to be true. And that middle term is the link between the two starting statements.
Yeah.
But in practice, Ibn Kammūna used hads in a broader way. It wasn't always so strict, and he didn't always spell out the specific syllogism or the middle term that's being revealed.
Yeah.
What's really interesting here, in terms of how we think about knowledge, is that hads was like a bridge between step-by-step logical reasoning and knowing something more immediately.
So it's kind of like those aha moments you have when you're working through logic, but maybe even more fundamental to how we learn things.
Yeah, exactly.
And our source says it's similar to how Avicenna talked about having revelations of his own existence, which suggests that maybe there was a shift in epistemology toward relying more on those personal internal insights.
Right.
And then later on, hads was even used to justify things like alchemy and astrology, which really blurs the line between knowledge we get through reasoning and knowledge that's revealed to us.
Yeah, totally.
So Hans gave people a way to explain how someone could know something for sure without going through a long process of reasoning it out. It could explain things like breakthroughs in science and prophetic inspiration, both of which seem to involve getting this special access to truth.
Exactly. It became a way to explain how people could know things without having to go through that step-by-step reasoning, like a shortcut to truth, you could say.
Right. And our source says that Hans has two main uses: understanding prophecy and explaining why some people are just really good at science, both of which involve this sudden grasp of knowledge. So let's start with prophecy in his examination. He seems to downplay the political side of what prophets do and focuses more on how they have this advantage in knowing things because their Hans is so perfect.
Yeah, for Ibn Kammūna, the amazing knowledge prophets have, it wasn't really about them being political leaders. It was more about this super strong intuition they had. He even says something pretty bold, that Hans is the basis of all human knowledge. Like
Wow.
everything we learn, it either comes from our own intuition or from someone else teaching us something they knew through intuition.
It's all about intuition then.
Pretty much, yeah. And he imagined a whole range of how strong people's intuition could be, from those who rarely experience it to those who can solve almost any problem through it. And unlike Ibn Sina, he didn't see it as always happening instantly. It could be the quickest and shortest instant. He even said that at the highest level of intellect and morality, people could understand almost everything humans are capable of knowing, not through tradition or learning, but by directly grasping these middle terms and proofs. So it's not just a feeling, there's logic to it.
Right. So hands for him, it actually fits into formal logic because it gives you that missing middle term you need for a syllogism to work.
Exactly.
So even though the person might not be thinking about the whole syllogism consciously, their intuitive knowledge, at least theoretically, can be demonstrated and explained logically.
Exactly. It's not just some mystical thing. It has a rational foundation in his system.
Okay, now let's look at the new wisdom and how Hans fits in there. He includes it as hadsiyat, meaning intuitive judgments, as part of how he classifies the different judgments we use as premises in syllogisms. Now, Ibn Sina didn't include this in his own system, and Suhrawardi used different categories. But Ibn Kammūna, he uses that classic example from Aristotle, the one about the moon's light coming from the sun, to make his point.
Right.
So he's working with these established philosophical ideas, but also bringing in his own emphasis on how intuition shapes those basic judgments and premises in logical reasoning. And by using a familiar example, he's showing how his ideas connect to what came before.
Right. It's like he's saying, look, I'm building on what you already know,
Mm.
but adding this new layer of understanding about intuition.
Exactly. And he even quotes Ibn Sina's definition of hads from El-Isharat. He contrasts fiqh, which means thinking things through step by step, with hads, where that middle term in a syllogism just pops into your head without you having to consciously search for it or deduce it. Then, in the new wisdom, he gives all these examples of knowledge that he thinks comes from hads. How the planets move, the automatic biological functions in animals, how the intellect is higher than the soul, and the metaphysical idea that bodies are just shadows of spiritual things.
Wow, that's a lot.
Yeah. He also connects hads to tajriba, which means repeated experience, and how that helps us access the hidden knowledge in science.
So it's not just about pure thought. It's about experience, too.
Right.
Those different examples really show how broadly Ibn Kammūna thought hads could be used,
Yeah.
covering everything from the stars to biology to metaphysics. And that connection he makes between hads and tajriba, that's really important for anyone who studies how we know things, because it suggests that intuition and what we observe through experience, they're not necessarily opposites. They can actually work together to help us understand the deeper truths of how the world works.
Okay, now if we look at his commentary on Suhrawardi's Al-Talwahat, intuition or ishraq in the Ishraqi system, that's a central concept. And while Ibn Kammūna is mostly explaining Suhrawardi's ideas in this commentary, he does emphasize how people have different capacities for hads.
Right.
You know, there are those who aren't as sharp intellectually, and then there are these prophet-like holy souls who have this incredible intuitive insight. He also talks about how Hods helps us understand natural stuff, like what's going on in the atmosphere, and the rational soul in animals.
So even within this commentary, he's really going with that Ishraqi idea about intuition being a primary source of knowledge. And he's reinforcing this idea that people have different levels of intuition. Some are just naturally more gifted at getting this direct intellectual insight, maybe even to a point where it's like prophetic understanding.
Yeah. Now, in key issues in the science of wisdom, Hands doesn't show up in the logic section, but it comes back in the psychology section. And he says psychology is the most important science because the soul is similar to God. He talks about how different human souls have different abilities to know things, and how the potential to know almost everything, that's like a taste of the divine.
Wow.
And he says even people who don't have hands naturally, they might be able to experience something similar through Sufi practices, like being alone, meditating, listening to music, and praying. And again, he links hands to tajriba, saying it's a natural gift.
So it sounds like he's saying there might be more than one way to get to intuitive knowledge.
Right.
He's saying some people are born with it, but others who aren't as naturally gifted, they might get there through spiritual practice, like bridging the gap between innate and acquired intuition. For you as a philosopher, that connection between intuition and these practical disciplines like Sufism, that's got to be interesting, right?
Oh, yeah, definitely. And then it's really interesting when you look at his more spiritual writings like Kalimat Wajiza, Nithbal al-Mabda, he basically stops using the word hods. Instead, he talks about gifted people who just get these complex things that others don't. And he still connects that to tajriba, to experience.
Right.
He uses words like din salim, which means a sound mind, and du fitana, which means clever, to describe that immediate understanding. And even the Sufi term talk, which is often used as a synonym for intuition by thinkers like Ibn Sina and Surawarbi, and which he himself uses in the New Wisdom, it's not there in these religious texts.
So that change in terminology in his religious writing, that's interesting. Makes you wonder, does it mean he changed his mind about this immediate knowledge, or was it just a choice he made for that specific audience, that kind of writing?
Right.
But he keeps emphasizing tajriba, and he uses other words to talk about this instant intellectual grasp. So it seems like that underlying concept of getting insight in a flash, that's still important, even without the specific term hands.
So the overall picture seems to be that Ibn Kammūna thought intuition was a real, valid way to get to true conclusions. And for him, Hods is all about revealing that middle term in a logical argument, even if you don't see the whole argument laid out.
Right.
And that intuitive understanding, it's always linked to experience, tajriba, but why he changed his words in his later religious writings, that's still up for debate. It just shows how complex these old philosophical texts can be.
Yeah, it does. It's a good reminder for us as historians of philosophy that we need to be really careful about context. You know, who the writer was talking to, what kind of writing it is. The relationship between those technical terms and the actual ideas underneath, that's always important to consider.
Okay, so let's shift gears a bit and look at Ibn Kammūna's thoughts on piety and ethics. Our source talks about these two treatises that were published recently,
Okay.
and both emphasize both knowledge, ilm, and practice, amal. That was a common pairing for Sufi thinkers. And he talks to the reader as someone who uses their intellect, as a seeker of perfection, a seeker of salvation and perfection. I think this focus on both understanding and action, that's going to be relevant for you, right?
Oh, absolutely. That emphasis on intellectual understanding and actually putting it into practice, that's a long tradition in ethical thought. It recognizes that knowledge is necessary, but it's not enough on its own for being a truly good person.
Yeah.
And the way Ibn Kammūna talks directly to the reader, it shows that reason is active in this pursuit of spiritual and moral development.
Yeah. The philosophical ideas he presents in these writings are consistent with his other works. But here, ilm means self-knowledge specifically.
Right.
Like understanding your flaws and what you owe to God. And the goal is to detach from the world and focus on the afterlife. Then the parts about Emil give us the ethical system, which is rooted in piety.
Yeah, that idea of ilm as self-awareness with a spiritual dimension, that's key to his ethics here. It's not just about abstract intellectual stuff. It's about knowledge that changes how you relate to the world and the divine.
Yeah. And what's interesting is that he doesn't seem to see any tension between reason and revelation in these writings. It's quite different from thinkers like Ibn Sina, al-Ghazali, and Maimonides, who all struggled with those perceived conflicts between philosophy and religious doctrine. When he talks about God's existence and attributes, it's very straightforward, often emphasizing God's goodness and generosity.
So in these ethical writings, he's really presenting this harmonious view of reason and revelation.
Right.
It's like he's saying they're fundamentally aligned, which might reflect his own experience moving between those intellectual and religious worlds.
Yeah. And he spends a lot of time talking about the soul, nafs, in subtle insights. He emphasizes that it's almost divine and that it survives death.
Okay.
He starts off in a more philosophical way, but then he shifts to a more Sufi-influenced approach. He highlights the qalb, the heart, as the center of goodness and defines it as the eye of nafs. But he doesn't present the usual Sufi idea of a separation or conflict between the heart and the soul.
So he's blending those philosophical and Sufi ideas about the soul. That's cool. He recognizes that Sufi emphasis on the heart as the source of spirituality and morality, but he keeps it connected to his earlier understanding of the soul, the nafs,
Right.
and a more unified view of his self.
Yeah. He even says that there's this consensus among the masters of traditional religions and intellectual schools that salvation depends on believing in God, the afterlife, and doing good deeds. And he calls them the people of wisdom and revelation. Our source points out that this idea of intellectual and religious harmony, it was later challenged by people like Ibn Taymiyyah.
So he saw a possibility for these different paths to truth and salvation to come together on some basic principles,
Right.
which, later interpretations would push back against.
He does put amal practice as less important than ilm knowledge. But he says ethical action isn't just some compromise. It actually strengthens your knowledge by giving you this spiritual reward. He says the postures of the bodily limbs lift lights into the heart. It's a beautiful image for how connected our actions are to our inner illumination.
Yeah, really poetic. It highlights how powerful ethical action is in his system.
Yeah.
It's not just about doing the right thing outwardly. It's about cultivating wisdom and spiritual insight through your actions.
And even though Subtle Insights is dedicated to a Muslim patron and written in a way that reflects Muslim piety, our source says it doesn't have specifically Muslim stuff in it. It seems to be driven by a more general kind of spirituality that works for different monotheistic traditions, and they even draw a parallel with Judah Halevi's Kuzari.
Oh.
Plus, the Quranic verse he quotes, there are similar ones in Jewish and Christian scriptures.
It's interesting.
So it seems like Ibn Kammūna was maybe trying to create a kind of universal philosophical piety.
Right, yeah. It seems like he was trying to come up with a kind of piety that goes beyond any one religion, using the common ground in Abrahamic monotheism. And it's hard to say how much of his ethics comes from Jewish thought, which also kind of supports that idea that he was working on this broader Abrahamic philosophical ethics.
Okay, let's talk about those paradoxes, the shubuhat that are connected to Ibn Kammūna. They've fascinated philosophers for centuries.
Yeah, the paradoxes.
One example is the liar paradox, which he talks about in The New Wisdom. Then there's the problem of unity, shuhat adahud.
Okay.
It asks whether this idea of necessary existence, which people have basically equated with God since Messina, whether that automatically means there can only be one.
That's a big one.
Right. He argues that because everything's connected and because having multiple necessary existences would lead to a contradiction, there can only be one. But other thinkers have criticized these arguments.
Those paradoxes really show how sharp and curious his mind was. He wasn't afraid to tackle these fundamental philosophical problems that still challenge people today.
You know, that problem of unity in particular, it goes deep into the nature of God and existence. It shows the kinds of debates that were happening in Islamic philosophy at the time.
And there's also this tricky argument about the creation of the world, Huduth al-Alam. It involves a logical move called conversion by contraposition, and he used it to try and prove that creation happened right away. He even told Nasir al-Din al-Tusi about this proof, but Tusi found the logical mistakes in it. It just goes to show even brilliant philosophers can make mistakes.
Yeah, for sure. It really highlights how important it is to be rigorous with logic. And it shows the value of talking to other smart people and having them critique your ideas, to help you make your arguments better. Even the most convincing arguments can have flaws, and it takes careful analysis and discussion to find them. Right. Our source ends by mentioning that there have been more editions of Ibn Kammūna's works published lately. That's really good news for scholarship. We've got new editions of Tonka al-Lahaf, a new edition of The New Wisdom, and even multiple editions of his commentary on Suhrawardi's Talwat, although we still need